Hello, everyone, and welcome to Heads Up, the weekly podcast of the National Headache Foundation. I'm Dr. Lindsay Weitzel, migraine strategist, chronic daily migraine survivor, and founder of the Facebook group Migraine Nation. I'm here every week bringing you tips, tidbits, and important information on migraine and headache disease. Today, we have a special podcast. It's going to kick off a series of podcasts that are with important people in the field who spoke at Retreat Migraine that was put on by CHAMP. So I'm here today with Dr.Bill Young, professor of neurology at Thomas Jefferson University and president of Miles for Migraine. Hello, Dr. Young. How are you today?
I'm good. Hello.
Thank you so much for being with us. Our topic today is stigma associated with migraine and headache disease. And Dr. Young is a very important person to talk to in this area. He's completed a study on stigma and migraine. He gave a talk at Retreat Migraine on stigma and migraine, and it was very popular. And I just wanted to bring some of that important information to everyone today. So, Dr. Young, first, can you just define stigma and its relationship to migraine disease for us?
So stigma is when society devalues the person with a particular condition, in this case, migraine. Mm-hmm. And in devaluing them, that involves things like what people say, what institutions are willing to recognize, whether they are willing to make accommodations, whether they simply give somebody with migraine kindness, mm-hmm. And what they need to handle their disease.
Right. So I experienced chronic daily migraine for 26 years, and now I still experience a lot of migraine, but I would say that we want to make the point that stigma doesn't just happen in the workplace. I think people jump in and think workplace, but it happens at home, in families, with our friends, and most of us are pretty familiar with it.
Yeah, I mean, it's everywhere. It's it's throughout society. So everybody is touched, and these negative attitudes are sort of baked into what people learn about migraine, and it'll be your doctor too, because your doctor is a part of society, like, your mother-in-law is, right. And, your employer is.
Right. So let's talk about your study. I think you found an interesting relationship between stigma associated with migraine and the stigma associated with epilepsy. Can you discuss that for a minute?
Sure. First of all, we picked epilepsy because it's considered kind of the poster child for a neurologic disease with stigma attached to it. So, in medieval times, people were possessed, and, this concept of, a kind of moral worthlessness of somebody with epilepsy, mm-hmm. Is a part of the history of neurology and continues on to this day in some circles. So we picked that disease, mm-hmm. and we compared our patients in our office with the epilepsy clinic across the street.
Right.
And people with migraine had actually a little bit more stigma attached to their disease than the people with epilepsy.
Right. Why do you think that is, that there's more stigma associated with migraine than with epilepsy?
Our results were pretty clear. And it was because there was more disability in the people with migraine than the people with epilepsy. Okay. So when we took out the disability, it was about the same for chronic migraine and a little bit better for episodic migraine.
Okay.
But my migraine patients that we studied were on average more disabled than the people with epilepsy across the street.
Right. Okay. Do you feel, do you find that stigma associated with migraine is worse for people with chronic migraine than for people with episodic migraine? Is stigma related to the severity or the frequency of the disease?
Yes. It's clearly much worse in chronic migraine, and it turns out it's for two reasons. Number one, people with chronic migraine overall have much more disability. Mm-hmm. So what I was saying before, since the stigma attaches to the disability, mm-hmm. It is a bigger factor after, and there's more stigma in chronic migraine. But there's also, we found another little factor that even if the disability was the same between a person with episodic migraine and a person with chronic migraine, chronic migraine was a little bit more stigmatized.
Okay.
I think that the reason for that is that, people think that migraine should be an episodic disorder and not a chronic one.
Right.
And so they're just less comfortable with somebody that there's something worse about their brain or something if they're, less appealing to somebody who doesn't understand this if they have chronic migraine than episodic.
Right. I think people often think migraine is a problem with a beginning and an end. And if they see someone whose migraine is continuous, they don't know what to do with that. Are people with migraine less likely to seek out care, for example, with physicians due to stigma, do you think?
Yes, I do think so. That's just part of the general medical literature on stigma. Stigma keeps people from, asking for the resources and searching and finding the resources that they need to find to take care of their diseases.
Right. I think there's a lot of reasons people with migraine either stop going to the doctor or don't go at all. And unfortunately, stigma is one of the things that makes it worse. You were involved in creating new vocabulary around how we speak about migraine disease. I believe you put this out with CHAMP. I call it the Headache and Migraine Disease Language and Image Guide. Can you tell us why you think our vocabulary surrounding our disease is so important?
Well, in the language, we embed concepts about, what we're talking about, in this case, migraine. And, so it's something we can choose to use less stigmatizing language or language that portrays this complex disease in ways that are more true. So I do want to say that, at this point, while I started the process about the language guide, it is now owned by CHAMP. It is what patients have endorsed through CHAMP.
Right.
And, there were some changes and some differences with what I thought. And, I'm a physician. I believe that, everybody has, this is language the physicians use, the patients uses, but above all, the voice of patients and how they want to be is number one.
Yeah, that's very important. Can you give us an example, a couple of examples of the language from the guide? I think one of them is that we have migraine, not migraines, plural. What is the reason for that?
Yeah, to me, this is the easiest change that people can make, and it's kind of non-threatening to someone. Even though you hear it all the time, and frankly, by now it drives me crazy. But, migraine is something you have with you all the time, whether you're having an attack or not. We'll talk about somebody's asthmas.
Right.
We talk about their asthma, and they have asthma, they get asthma attacks. I think that's a perfect analogy for migraine.
Yeah, I like that. I have one last question for you. Do you find that the experience of stigma will make migraine disease worse?
Yes. We know that people who are discriminated against experience more pain. That discrimination magnifies the experience of pain.
Okay.
If you think about stigma and discrimination, they're almost the same thing. It's like kind of hard to tease what's different between stigma and discrimination.
Right.
If you think about how severe and pervasive stigma is, it makes sense that the same biological process that makes pain be more severe if you're simultaneously being discriminated against will also make migraine disease more severe, adding another layer of severity on top of what you would otherwise biologically be making.
Okay. Well, I think that's an important point. I think that perhaps it's something we don't talk about enough, how our stigma can make us feel worse. Our stigma can affect our lives, and it's something we need to pay attention to. Is there anything else you'd like to add to our topic of stigma and migraine?
Well, I think people should investigate for themselves, like how they're going to deal with stigma.
Mm-hmm.
Don't just sit back and take it.
Mm-hmm.
Think about strategies, whether it's interpersonal, like have you developed self-stigma where society has taught you to put yourself down? And if that's the case, what are you going to do about it?
Mm-hmm.
And when there is a situation where you're being stigmatized against because you have migraine, like how do you deal with it? How do you educate or confront, or what's the right approach? And
Okay.
I'd like people to think of, okay, like I'm going to educate one person a day or some strategy, or I'm going to have change my internal self-talk about my disease, or
Right.
something you're doing to contribute to fixing this problem, both within yourself and, across the board in society.
Right. Very good points. All right. Well, thank you so much for meeting with us today. This is Lindsay Weitzel with Dr. Bill Young signing off on Heads Up, the weekly podcast of the National Headache Foundation. And we will see you here again next week.